What's up, guys, and welcome back to the Goosenov Show. Today, we are going to be talking about ownership and renting, and kind of where we find ourselves today. So, just kind of a brief overview of European history and how Europe, at least, has dealt with ownership in the past. Under feudalism and in more, how would you say it, oligarchic or even aristocratic societies, ownership was where society's power was vested in. So, the land-owning class for pretty much all of European history was the nobility. These were the people who controlled society. But under feudalistic Europe, the nobility, they needed to basically pay rent to the king. So, they paid up their money to the king, and then, the serfs, rented their land from the lords. So historically, at least in Europe, rent payment was a sign that, you are in a lower class than the person you're paying rent to. You're subservient to them. They have some authority over you. And if you understand feudalism, you'll realize that feudalism was a society where social class was everything. Today we think that, class is easily attained through money, right? Kind of the American dream. If you just earn enough money, then you'll become part of the rich class, and that means you have authority, you have power in society. But aristocratic Europe was different. Social class, your position in the nobility wasn't something that you just bought your way into. I mean, I'd say, sometimes you could do that, like in, pre-Jacobin France. But to a large extent, your position in the nobility had to be earned. You became knighted if you did something, valorous, or you did something to benefit the king, to show loyalty to the king. And that's essentially what nobility was. It was a way of showing that you were willing to sacrifice for, the ultimate authority in the land. It wasn't something you could just buy. Now, fast forward to today. After the Jacobin Revolution, after the American Revolution, even going back to the English Civil Wars, the parliamentary revolutions, Europe moved away from, rigid feudal societies into, a more, let's say, democratic way of running things. And one of the results of that is that, things have become more meritocratic, but they've also kind of collapsed into finance being the main driver of your position in society. It's no longer based on loyalty or fealty or, oaths. It's based on, just a singular variable, money, which, to some extent, all society's been like this. But today, that's essentially the only thing. And so that's just outlining kind of how power has changed throughout history. In the past, your landlord had political authority over you. He was like a small king. But today, your landlord doesn't really have that. People are more free to do things. But I would argue the same methods of control, they exist throughout all societies, right? I think that the more things change, the more things stay the same. There's nothing new under the sun. And ultimately, political organizations exist to kind of keep people in line. And, well, to keep people in line, to create order and to make society on some level work. Just because, your laws are different, just because you say things are different, doesn't mean they actually are. One example of this is taxation, right? In older, primitive states, bureaucratic states, you would have governments rely primarily on taxation to get revenue. Or, like in the case of the American Revolution, you had the founding fathers take out huge loans to finance their war. And then, they paid for it. They paid for those loans with taxes. With the advent of monetary policy, we still pay taxes, but that's not where a majority of our, governmental money comes from. It comes from monetary policy, which is basically, just increasing the money supply, which just means you're printing a lot of money. The problem is, it's basically just taxation with another name, but you're increasing the tax rate on everybody, right? Like, what does monetary policy mean? You're printing a lot of money, which means that the value of every single dollar in the economy is now less. Which, that's just inflation, right? And that's how we pay for, our current system. Print more money, maintain the current standards, and, the system keeps running. But it's taxation at the end of the day. Same thing with labor. I think that, abolishing slavery or moving away from slavery is the right move. And I think the more society moves away from slavery, the better. But just because slavery is illegal today doesn't mean that countries aren't practicing it. And I mean, some places they literally do, textbook slavery. But in other countries where maybe they can't call it slavery, I think they still do what essentially amounts to slavery, right? Like offshoring jobs to third world countries. A lot of these places, the labor conditions are essentially, slave labor. But I would also say that kind of, debt-based systems are another form of, maybe even white-collar indentured servitude. I'd say, our current college loan system is a lot like this. You take out a huge college loan, you can't just pay it back in a year. You're tethered to that loan for a very long time, So what happens if let's say you don't like your degree or you don't want to work? You don't really have the choice, because if you don't pay off that loan, it's going to explode, and then you're just, your life is going to be over because you can't pay off, or you can't get bankruptcy for student loans. So I think, essentially the way that our college system works is it's indentured servitude. You get into a bunch of debt and you're forced to work to pay it off, right? Now, was it designed this way? No. I mean, the federal student loan program was designed to, let's just make sure that more people are educated. That's why it was built. But I think that what's going on in society is much deeper than some evil person at the top, some evil billionaire saying, "Oh, I'm just going to do something, terrible. I'm going to enslave my population." No. I think this is much deeper. I think the beliefs that run your society, the spirit of your society manifests through, a bunch of tiny decisions by leaders. And slowly those decisions converge into archetypal societies, like a society whose primary labor source is slave labor, right? The Romans were like this. The American South, to a large extent, was like this. Most societies in history were slave societies. And I think that, even if you have laws against it, even if you have laws against this and that and blah, 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 if your society starts adopting values, in line with a slave society, for example, it's going to start practicing slavery. And I think that our society definitely falls into that category, like 100%. We outsource to foreign labor because it's cheaper. So we're relying on that type of slavery. The H-1B system, that's slavery to a large extent. It's an exploitative labor practice, right? Like, what are you doing with the H-1B program? You're basically saying, I'll let you live in a country with a higher standard of living, but I'm going to pay you a ton of money less, just because you really want to be in this country. So companies get a really good deal on labor, but with like tons of externalities. Anyway, so point being, just because a society calls itself something doesn't mean it is what it says it is. So, what I want to talk about is renting versus owning. I think what America was founded on was the idea of, I think it's called democratic republicanism or republicanism, which one of the kind of tenets of that, of America's founding principles. I'm not talking about, the current GOP republicanism. I'm talking about like a deeper cultural thing here. One of the ideas, I think Jefferson was really a really big proponent of this, but it was the idea that we should make as many people landowners as possible. We should make it so that, there are a lot of farming landowners. What does that mean? It means that you take the aristocracy and you try to expand it to as many people as possible. Now, is that a great idea? It really depends. But something even deeper than that is the notion that it is good for more people to own. And Jefferson's idea was a lot of people should be, subsistence farmers. But, especially with our modern day, that's not really, that system doesn't really make much sense, just given the fact that, a small percentage of people can, do far more efficient farming than, having most people be farmers. But the core idea and the core principle there is, I'd say, solid. Get people to own more and get people to be, somewhat self-sufficient. And why is that? I think a lot of us kind of take it for granted that this is a good idea. And some people might not. Some people might think this is a stupid idea. But what does mass land ownership mean? It means that people have a stake in society. It means that people aren't just, passing through, that they have a vested interest in, the land, in the future of the country, in building something, right? Because if you own land, are you going to be content, turning your, your little plot of land into like a garbage dump? Probably not. You're incentivized to take the land and make it better and better and better. Why is that? Because, that builds wealth for you. It also builds a more beautiful life for you. There's a lot of reasons to improve the land you're on if you're an owner. But this comes at the expense of responsibility, right? If you own land, if you own a house, what happens if your roof caves in? What happens if, there's some major repairs that need to be done? You don't get to just, leave. It's not an apartment. If you leave, then, you're going to leave a lot of money on the table too. So being a landowner means that you're responsible for the land and you need to care about the future of it. Now, the reason you wouldn't want to do this, the reason you wouldn't want to be a landowner, is because you don't want to be responsible. Because you want to be able to move to one area to the next area. You want to be a cosmopolitan, a city dweller, someone with no roots in an area. You want to be a person who's not responsible for the future of a geographic location. And I guess there's a lot of benefits to something like that too. But you have to think about this. On the whole, if more people were owners, would society be better or worse than if most people were renters? I would say, if you look at the history of America, a society that owns is much, much better than a society that rents. And you can just look at it in the economic progress America saw. But I would say if a society is one that just keeps renting, then people have no concern for the future. Because, okay, well, what happens if, my land that I'm renting, has a major problem, like a really major problem? I'll just leave. I don't need to care about my land. I don't need to care about my community. I don't need to care about the future of the area I'm in because, my position is liquid. I don't need to, it's not a hassle to sell my house. I can get up and move wherever I want. And I would say that American culture, maybe even European culture and other cultures have kind of collapsed into this renter mindset. And if you read a book called Bowling Alone, it details kind of one of the effects of this, which I think is atomization, right? If people aren't connected to the place they inhabit, if there's no incentive for kind of long-term thinking, then I think people become atomized. And that's not the only reason, but I'd say it's a contributing factor. Now you might say, well, people actually want to own. People want to own, they don't want to rent. So your argument is flawed. And to that I would say, you're right. I think that a lot of people still do want to own. I think a lot of people still are married to the founding principles of the United States. And I would say a lot of this drive to be a renter is a drive that comes from top down. It's imposed. It's not something that is organic. And you just got to look at the WEF, the World Economic Forum types, who are pushing these ideas of, you will own nothing and you will be happy. You're going to eat the bugs. You're going to rent, and a lot of these like corporate interests, like, BlackRock and these companies that want people to be renters. Why do they want this, right? Why does a company want to be tied down to a house that can get a hole in its roof, a house that costs a lot of money? Two reasons. One, land is power. This is a fundamental thing that has echoed throughout history. And just because our system is different doesn't mean that land doesn't equal power. So, just like the lords of medieval Europe, land still means power. The second reason is that our economy operates on a very interesting principle, which I'm going to call there's a name for it, but let's just call it stochastic noise. So what that means is the amount of things that exist in an economy, or the amount of, let's say the amount of things that exist cancels out any major errors that could happen. So insurance, right? How does insurance work? Insurance companies bet money that the average person is not going to have like a major accident, or they're not going to die in any given year, or they're not going to have a huge health issue. But everyone's paying money, right? Everyone's paying money. But sometimes there is going to be someone who, needs a life insurance payout. So, the insurance company is going to have to use a lot of its profits on that. But on the whole, more people are not asking for life insurance payouts than people who are. So the money you lose is kind of lost in the noise. The same thing and Grant Cardone talks about this, but what do you call it? Being a landlord isn't just free money. There are some people who are nightmare tenants. There are some people who, they just completely destroy the place that they're living in. They're totally, they're just immoral people. They don't pay rent. They don't do this, they're nightmares. So if you rent a place to somebody, it's not just a free paycheck. Unless you have volume, unless you have a bunch of different paychecks coming in at the same time, right? If I have one apartment, that's my one source of income, So if the person is untrustworthy, everything's riding on that. And if my one source of income is cut off, then that's everything, there's a huge risk in that. But what happens if I have 10 apartments, right? Each tenant doesn't matter as much, right? Because there's other sources of income coming in. What about 30? What about 100? What about 1,000? At the end of the day, the more cash flows that come in, even if there's unpredictability in the cash flows, the more you can build a stable business on it. So, If you own, let's say you're a huge company that has like 1,000 houses. Each year there's probably going to be like 10 houses that have like major repairs that are needed. But if you got 1,000 houses, you just take some of the money from one house and shove it into another one. So corporations are incentivized to consolidate as much land as possible because, just given the nature of how this math works, it's a pretty sweet gig. Just like insurance, just like this, just like that. The problem is, I think it comes at the expense of the individual. And I would also say corporate management, you would say, oh, this is actually a really efficient system. I would argue no. Because one of the things that corporations have to do is they have to kind of smooth over all the details. They have to treat everyone the exact same. If you've been in a hotel recently, like 15 years ago, 20 years ago, hotels were very different. You could go into a hotel and you could expect very different things. Some hotels had some stuff in their fridges. Other hotels had like a chocolate on the pillow. They had like some, interesting stuff. Every hotel was a different experience. But today, every single hotel is exactly the same. So, and this is just a fact of corporations simplifying their processes, making it easier for them to scale, easier for them to manage everything. It's standardization. The cost of standardization is it dehumanizes people. It steamrolls over, all the unique differences that produce culture. Because human beings are cultural beings. We're not cogs in a machine. And the problem is, if you have a system that works for everybody, you don't leave anything up to, the differences that would make things human. So that's kind of like a, wishy-washy high-level thing. But what it really means at the crux of it is this is ultimately a battle between the individual human will and the will of giant systems. Like a corporation is a giant system with outputs and inputs, right? The inputs are demands from the economy, from people. People want a nice hotel to stay in. And the output of the hotel corporation is to give you a room to stay in, right? So it's a good deal. And the corporation is an agent whose job is, number one, to survive, but number two, to produce those outputs so it can keep getting inputs of money. So I would argue that corporations are basically like a form of AI. Like, they are agentic AI. Corporations are, AGI is a real thing, and corporations are that manifestation. And you could say, well, no, that doesn't make any sense. That's stupid. But I would argue, why not? Because at your job, you probably do some, you're like a little cog in a machine, right? You do you fill out some stupid Excel sheet, or you do some tiny little task. You don't even know what it really does, but you do it. It fits into this giant system, and a robot could probably do your job, right? But you do it just because right now it's easier to do it that way. Some people have certain decisions that go into a corporation, but for the most part, everyone's just kind of going through motions. And And ultimately, all these tiny little algorithmic decisions made by human beings results in a system with inputs and outputs, right? Just like a person has inputs and outputs. A person does things. A person has a will. So does a corporation. So corporations are just like, AIs, like in a very real sense. It's just a human hybrid AI system. And I think the problem we have right now is, corporations are very good. They're very good at doing these things, right? They're very good at, producing outputs given inputs. The problem is corporations have no idea what people actually, I'd say, maybe not want, but maybe what's good for people, or what's, they don't know what it is to be like a human being. You can ask people, you can have a corporation ask people like, what do you want? Or it can do like psychological surveys, but ultimately, like an AI it can't see a painting. It can't smell a flower. It can't listen to music. It doesn't have qualia, which just means consciousness, conscious experience. The people within a corporation do, but on the whole, a corporation is blind to reality. It's just kind of operating, it's reacting to different variables, right? Like stock price. Corporations work really well when they have let's say a king-like CEO at the top who kind of is a visionary, who sees, where he needs to steer the corporation and then makes those decisions. Like I'd say Steve Jobs was a person like that. Like he said, I think someone like put the iPhone idea across his desk, and he realized, okay, no, this is a good idea. We should pursue this, right? Because smartphones had existed before Apple, but he just figured out a way to push Apple's, economic power behind a system that actually worked. Like without Steve Jobs, you wouldn't have the user-friendly experience we have today with our current like smartphone infrastructure. And with his death, what happened with the corporation of Apple? It's just stupid now. It doesn't do anything, right? Like, what has Apple produced? It produced like, some Oculus goggles that no one really cared about, and that's about it. At the end of the day, the only thing a corporation can do, it can't really innovate. That's people innovate. Because I think people are like conduits for ideas, but that's a completely different topic. Or maybe it isn't. Corporations are very good at optimizing, right? Because optimization is algorithmic. Evolution is an optimization algorithm. And I'm not, like you could say, you're just throwing words around. No. In a very real sense, right? The math behind evolution like works like this. A gene is encoded as like a 0 or a 1. Like it's some binary sequence. And genetic code is like a bunch of these, zeros or ones, or, what is it in DNA, like A or G or something like that. But you basically, you have information encoded. And you could say each gene is just, the 0 or the 1, but that's not the case. A gene is both like a 0 or a 1, but it's also like all the zeros and ones next to it. So, if you have, let's say you have like 0, 0, 0 or 0, 1, 0. 0 and 0, 1, that's a gene. And then 1, 0, that's another gene. And 0, 1, 0, that's a gene. And then 0 is a gene, and 1 is a gene, and 0 is a gene. Anyway, not to confuse you, but like the point is, there's a lot of ways to encode information in genetics. And basically how the math works out through the process of evolution is, you have this genetic sequence, you connect it with like another genetic sequence, and then you splice the genes together. You cut out, let's say, half of one gene and half of another gene and shove them together, and then you produce offspring. And then you rank the fitness of the offspring, and then that leads to the likelihood that offspring produces another piece of offspring. And from that selection effect, you get improvement because of basically survivorship, maybe not survivorship bias, but because the survivors show what genes actually work. So basically, you are, at least in the real world, you're off-sourcing computational power just to the universe. You have the universe optimizing things for you. But if you run a evolutionary algorithm or a genetic algorithm on your computer, you can basically get the same results. Like literally, like if I wanted to, I don't know, evolve a walking algorithm for a robot, I could just code it up in the way that I described, and I would get algorithmic improvements. And I would say, in many cases, evolutionary algorithms are the best type of optimization algorithm, but there are many other types of optimization algorithms. Anyway, that was just a little aside to say, you don't need consciousness to make things better. You don't need decisions to make things better. You can kind of, let an algorithmic process do it for you. But what we have seen in history is the only way that, how would you say it? Paradigm shifts have occurred. The only way societies have changed in a huge way. The only way that's happened has been due to individuals. A person invented the Faraday cage. A person invented, integrated circuits. A person, was it Shockley, I think, invented the transistor as we know it today, or at least, the precursor to our current one. The MOSFET. And I think people are, as I said before, are conduits for ideas. Do we know how that works? No. If someone tells you that they know how ideas are formed, how we come up with innovations, they'd be, I don't know, they'd be lying to you. I don't think people fully realize how this stuff happens. But if you talk to many artists, they'll tell you that the ideas just kind of come from the ether, and they just hit you in the head, right? David Lynch, he said stuff like this. This is kind of how I do this, right? When I come up with a comic idea, I'm not meticulously crafting it. It just hits me in the head, fully formed, and then it's there. And you could say that this is just, your brain is just combining things it already knows, maybe, but I don't think I think that's only a small part of the picture. Regardless, it feels like we are a conduit for ideas. And even if that's not the case, there's something about human beings that allows us to create paradigm shifts. There's something special about human consciousness and human will. So, the problem that we face in the modern day is very efficient corporations and very atomized and disenfranchised people. And I think there are economic incentives that make this happen, right? Corporations want people to be renters. They want people to rely on them because it gives them repeatable sources of income. It gives them power. Corporations want people to be streamlined. They want people to be flattened because it allows them to predict the future better. It allows them to make these economic decisions more accurately, which means that they get to make more money accurately. The problem is it's at the expense of individuals. And as I laid out, since people are the only things that can innovate, not really corporations, the more you cede control from individuals and put it into the hands of like algorithmic systems, the more stagnation I think you get. Now, I don't think we're completely there yet, but I do see this as a risk, right? What happens if literally everything in your life is streamlined, is bureaucratized, is turned into a process where you don't really get a say in how things are? I mean, I'd say the United Kingdom is a lot like this. But like in many ways, it feels like that's kind of where we're going. And this, not to sound too much like, 1984, but it's like, I mean, that is the risk. And there are incentives to push us in that direction. So what's an alternative? It really comes down to culture, right? Because I think, you could say that people want to own houses, but at the same time, I think maybe a lot of people don't want to. A lot of people don't want to be responsible. A lot of people don't want to be owners. A lot of people would rather have other people decide things for them. And this is pretty foreign to me, but just listening to how people have talked to me about stuff, I think this might be a lot more common than you think. And the thing is, these people bemoan the fact that they don't own houses. But I would argue that their deep beliefs actually have created the economic conditions that led to them being unable to own houses in the first place. Because I think a lot of these people, they see the fact that, they see home ownership, and they only see the good parts of it. But they aren't willing to accept the responsibilities that come with that, right? So they push an anti-responsibility message, a degrowth message. They encourage a system which makes ownership impossible or economically disincentivized. And then they complain when they don't get the benefits of home ownership. So my point is, maybe it's our responsibility here. Maybe it's to an extent, our fault because of how we have set up society. It might be up to us to really think about what it takes on like the deepest level to create a system that is actually conducive towards power towards individual people. Right? What are the principles that are necessary to ensure that we don't get, enslaved by, corporate bureaucratic systems or governmental bureaucratic systems, right? It's all a type of bureaucracy. I mean, and I'd say this isn't an unheard of thing. I think that, Chinese civilization was basically run like this for thousands of years. The civil service exam, put people into the upper class, and if you didn't make it, if you didn't do well on the exam, then you were forced into being a peasant for the rest of your life. That's how bureaucracies work, right? This isn't capitalism. This is just a bureaucratic system. This is how human societies naturally settle if they choose bureaucracy. And I think a lot of people are doing this because, I don't know, the universe is a scary place. There's a lot of risk, right? There's a risk in ownership. There's responsibility. There's a responsibility in ownership. And I don't know, I'm just touching a little bit on these principles, but you could probably think about it a little more and think about, like, what does it take? Because just because you want an outcome doesn't mean your beliefs will lead you to that outcome. Oftentimes, your beliefs will lead you into really bad spots if you don't choose them carefully. And the problem is, I think most people in our democracy, they only see outcomes. They don't realize that what matters more than the outcomes is your beliefs. And your beliefs are not just necessarily right. Oftentimes, the first conclusion you come to, the first beliefs that you settle on, are wrong. Like, for example, the tabula rasa. That's been a powerful and intoxicating belief, held by many civilizations. And maybe not civilizations, but like certain time periods, this belief was posited by people. I think Rousseau, the impressionistic, the romantic periods in Europe and America. A lot of people really wanted the tabula rasa idea to be right. Same thing in Japan, which is funny. I read a primary source from Japan of people, of like these Japanese ambassadors coming to California and trying to understand how we did things in America. One thing they said is, they were shocked that there were carpets everywhere. Because in Japan there's a lot less there's less materials, so they were shocked that they didn't have carpets everywhere. But in America, we had carpets like even in like hotels and in dingy stores and stuff. And they were like, wow, how they must be really wealthy. This is incredible. But we just had like a good factory system that allowed us to build it. But one of the things they said was, Americans at that time didn't believe in the tabula rasa. They believed that, it was nature, not nurture. And these Japanese ambassadors, they were kind of laughing. They were like, oh, these dumb Americans, they don't realize that it's, who you are is, environmental. That's basically what they said. I'm not quoting, but that's essentially what they said. So they were positing the tabula rasa idea. Japan, these kind of Jacobean or Jacobin types. It's been an intoxicating idea. The reality is it's not true. And if you, and then you could say, well, no, I still believe it's true, blah, 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 but it's not. Psychology is, twin studies have disproven this. Like, modern science just shows that this is not true. And it's mostly a matter of degree, how much nature, how much nurture. It's not a question of, what do you call it? It's out of the question that, who your parents are, your family, all that stuff doesn't have an effect on who you are, right? And this is obvious. But it would be really nice. It would be really nice if your environment like completely shaped who you are. And it's, but the reality is it's wishful thinking. you have an idea of how you want reality to be. You have an idea of like a nice way things are, but oftentimes reality can be disappointing. The thing is, I think that a lot of people don't, and this isn't just with tabula rasa, this is with other things too, but I think a lot of times people are like, truth is too painful for them. So instead of biting the bullet on something, an uncomfortable fact of reality, they stick to their, a belief about reality, even if it's empirically shown to be false, until the bitter end. And I mean, I think ideology shows just how terrible the terrible consequences of that. But anyway, like, at the end of the day, human beings have an effect on how our societies operate. Currently, human beings still have a lot of autonomy. We still have a say. We still get to decide what society will look like. We don't live under a complete authoritarian rule yet. The individual isn't completely crushed. And I think we're living potentially in a narrow window where we still have a say of where things go. And I don't know. I think that in this time of potential change, right? With this rapid growth in technology, reshaping of states, new ways of conceptualizing governments, we gotta get the principles right. Like the founding fathers, right? After the American Revolution or during it, they had to figure out a good governmental system that we could rely on, right? If they just winged it, like, America wouldn't have been what it is today. And I think we're in a similar time. Like, if we don't get the principles right, if we don't get, the beliefs that shape society right, we could be dooming the next 100 years of civilization to misery. I just like think about what happened with the Soviet Union, like something like that. That's a very real possibility, or other things, right? And I think, you could say, oh, it could doom us to 100 years of just a terrible governance, or a miserable dystopia. And you could say, well, at worst, the worst thing that could happen is we end up like the Soviet Union and we collapse, in under 100 years. But what happens if the governmental system we create, it's terrible, people are miserable under it, but it's also super stable? Because the Soviet Union was not stable. What happens if it's just true enough? If it's just true enough that it's actually stable, but it's also false enough that it just creates a living hell for everyone in it. And I would argue, especially the way the boomers viewed the world, the way we are headed, or the way many people are headed, is through the acceptance of kind of luxury beliefs, of this insane wishful thinking that does not map onto reality at all, and that is chosen not through rigorous empirical evidence, through rigorous, playing devil's advocate, fighting your own ideas. It's not a lot of beliefs that people hold are chosen in a cavalier manner. They're not actually selected carefully. And our current democratic system is built in such a way that, the majority gets to decide where we go. And if the majority is not holding itself to a very high standard, if the majority does not care at all about how accurately its beliefs map onto reality, if all they care about is the outcomes and not the way to actually achieve those outcomes, I think you're setting yourself up for potentially just marching into, you're just rowing your boat off of a cliff. So, I don't know. I think, I think Plato talked about this. But to a large extent, our system is kind of ruled by mob. And I think that, hopefully people can start being a little more responsible with how they direct things. Or maybe, if you're a part of the oligarchic class, you could maybe use Bernaysian conditioning to, make people more informed. But I don't know. I think, The issue with the current state of America is I see just there's a lot of dumpster fires happening at the same time. So I don't know. Hopefully it can be solved. Because I think Rudyard Lynch, the guy who does what if alt hist, I think he said that America holds a lot of its problems on its sleeve. America is very honest with kind of or it's just very vocal about the issues it has. So he said that there's a potential that, things are they sound worse than they are. Even if that's the case, I think we gotta, consider what I've been talking about. Consider the beliefs that go into our society, instead of just the outcomes. And be a little more humble, because to assume that what you think is the solution is going to work is prideful. It's presumptive. And I think, when you're making decisions for hundreds of millions of people, you gotta be a little more responsible than that. But I don't know. Try and be a member of the landowning, class. I would argue. Don't be a renter, and don't approach reality. Don't approach logic. Don't approach your beliefs like a renter. Where you get to just run away if things don't go your way. That's such a cowardly thing. Things aren't going perfectly. I'll just move apartments. I'll just, leave my community. It's we gotta start building something in the world. You gotta care about the future. And I would say, maybe a lot of what we're seeing today is just the result of, hundreds of millions of people collectively ceasing to care about the future and only caring about the short term for themselves, not really thinking in a strategic manner, only thinking about what's in front of them and not about how they can help others. I don't know. Kind of like the boomers, but anyway. Well, let me know if you guys have any thoughts on this, because I think now we're in the time for, developing kind of answers to these problems, or finding a way to put tourniquets on our on on the bleeding wounds of our current society. And maybe there's nothing we can do. Oh, it's all over. There's nothing we can do, or maybe there's nothing wrong. But I don't know. I think everyone still has a responsibility to try and do what they can. And I don't know. Ultimately, I think it's up to us to kind of band together and try and solve problems. Because the more atomized we are, the more of like a renter we act like, the more powerless we'll be. So, I don't know. Maybe organizing is a solution. Because if we're fighting organizations, maybe the solution is to just come up with organizations of our own. But anyway, we'll talk about praxis in another day. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.